Hello, world. It's Catherine. Um, so I just thought I would give you a quick Well, I don't know how quick it'll be. We'll find out. You'll know by the time you start this because you'll see how long it is. But I'm just talking, so I don't know yet for how long I'm going to talk. But I wanted to let you know something about my background and how I learned to think critically. So this is Catherine's critical thinking bio. But I've been thinking about how did I come to have the critical thinking skills that I have, and I feel that they are fairly well developed. And it's not just that I have a good education, because people can have go to great schools and not have great critical thinking skills, and people can go to not great schools or not have a lot of schooling and be pretty good in their critical thinking skills. So I do have a master's degree, and I do think that's definitely a factor, which I will talk about a little bit, but that it's not necessary. It's just necessary to learn a few things. And also somebody who's really well educated could know a lot about certain things, but not really have been challenged in such a way that their critical thinking skills have been developed. And I think that's really what has happened in my life that has helped me to develop these skills. So the first thing is, really, when I was a kid, my dad was a journalist. And I learned some skills from him right when I was really little. So for instance, when I would cut clippings from a newspaper, back then there were newspapers. They were actually made of paper. And if you wanted to save an article, you had to take out a pair of scissors and cut the article. And I remember so clearly my dad insisting, whenever I did that for whatever reason, sometimes for school, that I needed to write down what newspaper did it come from and what was the date, because you had to know the context. Just a headline and the author's name is too little information to go on. And of course, you couldn't Google a person's name easily. You really need to know what newspaper and what was the date. So, for instance, an article about a certain person, if it was the Wall Street Journal writing about that person, you're going to have a different context if it's The Nation, the periodical The Nation, writing about that person. And if it's 1996, that's different from 2010. It's a whole different context. So you have to have not just the year, but the exact date, because you need to know what happened just before that thing, whatever the article was, and right after. So that's a very simple thing, but I'm shocked by how often, well, I don't see newspaper clippings anymore, but I was shocked in my life how often really smart and educated people would have newspaper clippings without having written on it what newspaper and what date. So that's just a really simple thing that I was taught really young. Also, because he had spent a lot of his life as somebody who had grown up poor, but around people who were a lot wealthier and more educated than he was. And so he had that experience of being kind of the odd man out and seeing. I remember him telling stories about people when he was working in the Wall Street area doing public relations, and talking about how Senator Kennedy at that time, Robert Kennedy, was a senator from New York. Of course, the Kennedy family is associated with Massachusetts, but Robert Kennedy was a senator from New York. And he wrote a letter to the Commerce and Industry Association about a certain topic. And the businessmen reading that letter joked about it and dismissed what Kennedy was saying. And my father, being from a poor background, really related to what Kennedy was saying. So that was just a great illustration of how where we are in the world affects how we see certain issues and certain people. So there were that was really important in my growing up. Second thing, just from my growing up, was that my parents I just had a stable family, you know, and my parents were very decent, good people, as I hope your story is the same. But that makes a difference. It makes a difference in one's ability to think and to what people one listens to. My parents were very accepting. They were very warm and open, and they didn't have prejudices against people because of their race or because they were gay or, you know, all these things. My parents might have had certain political leanings, but they never dismissed people because of who they were. In fact, my dad is very left-wing oriented in his politics. Many of his best friends were real right-wingers. And so that was a real education for me, that one could to love and care for someone who thought quite differently than you did. So those are kind of foundational things that anybody could have. Again, that has nothing to do with a formal education. And then I was also raised in a mainline Christian church, and in that church, it was just I was going to say mainline, kind of a mainstream Christian church. And I was really taught to have compassion. I was taught that what Jesus taught was compassion for people. And a very formative experience for me was that my minister in my church worked in a prison. And he brought some prisoners to the church. They had a day of leave. He brought them to the church to meet with the youth. I was in maybe 9th grade, something like that. So maybe 14 years old, 13. But yeah, I think 13 years old, something like that. And my town was all white, totally white. So I really never got to know Black people when I was young at all. And one of the prisoners that my minister brought was this huge Black guy. So, you know, in our society, we have ideas about huge Black guys. And this man was actually a murderer. He had actually murdered someone and was serving probably a life sentence. I don't remember, but imagine a life sentence for murdering someone. And he told me, I murdered someone and I deeply regret it. And I'm serving time and I'm trying to live my life better now. And I just remember thinking, I'm sitting next to this huge Black man who's a murderer, and he's not murdering me. In fact, I like him, and he seems warm and kind, and my minister trusts him and likes him and would never have brought him if he didn't know him well. My minister knew him well for a long time and obviously trusted him. And there may have been cops there watching. I don't remember that part. I just remember how deeply that affected me and changed forever. Something was forever unable to be quite so prejudiced against those who are imprisoned, even when they have committed the crime. And obviously, in terms of meeting an African-American person as a young white girl, huge effect on me. And you might think, what does that have to do with critical thinking? But it has a lot to do with critical thinking. It has a lot to do with critical thinking. The ability, what's not critical thinking is when we dismiss what someone says because they have committed a crime, because they're Black, or if we dismiss them because we think, you know, we have a certain amount of wealth and they're poor, so they must be lazy. You know, these kinds of things stop us. Prejudice stops us from having critical thinking skills. It's the most important thing. So that was all great. That, you know, very blessed. And I had some wonderful teachers in high school. I was at an excellent school in Connecticut, high school, public school. But it was a rich town that I was in. As I say, I was poor in a rich town, and so I benefited. And I recognize now, I didn't really recognize at the time, I would never have lived there if I hadn't been white. So I had a huge advantage being white, that allowed me to be in this town that had a wonderful school, almost like a private school, even though it was a public school because it was so well resourced. So I had some teachers who really wanted us as students, wanted to hear what we had to say. That's huge. Children who are taught to just, there's a right answer and a wrong answer, aren't going to develop critical thinking skills. And so I had teachers who actually wanted to know what we thought. And I remember, for instance, we were reading Huckleberry Finn. And I remember my English teacher, I would think I was in 11th grade or so maybe 16, 17 years old. And the teacher talked about how Huck and his friends didn't have a home. And I remember saying, well, the river is home for them. And I remember her saying, oh my gosh, Catherine, you're right. And that was so important to me as a young person to have a teacher I respected so much really take in my insight into some literature that she had read many times and really hear what I had to say. I remember that so profoundly because not everybody gets that. Not everybody gets that. So I had the benefit of teachers who actually were interested in what we had to say. And so that encouraged, when that happened, that encouraged me. I wanted to give her more insights because that felt really good to have her be impressed by what I had to say about a piece of literature that she knew really well. So it's so important that kids be allowed to express their own thoughts and opinions about things. So I had all of that before I even graduated high school, and there's much more I could probably say. But then I went, I didn't go straight to college. So my parents were wonderful enough that when I said I didn't want to go straight to college, they said, oh, all right. They really let me make my own choice. And even though everybody around us, all the adults around us, thought they were crazy for letting me make that choice. So I worked for a political organization when I was 18 years old for 2 years. And my job was going door to door, gathering money for this political organization. So that meant I was having political conversations with, 20, 30, 40 people a night for 2 years, trying to get them to give money. So I would give them my sort of standard line. And, most people would either say, great, I'll give you some money, or no, I'm not going to give you money. And most people, I would just go to the next door. But especially if I had made some money during the night, I often would have great conversations with people. And I remember one of the issues we were working on was that we were trying to stop a nuclear plant from being built. And this particular man, I knocked on his door, and he was a utility executive. He was a vice president at a utility. And he talked for about half an hour, 45 minutes. He wanted to convince me that I was totally wrong in the way I thought. And I guess I must have had enough money at that point that I was able to spend the time with him. I don't remember now what his argument was. For many years I did remember, and I was affected by what his argument was. He made a lot of sense, and he laid out his argument to this 18-year-old kid at his door, And one thing that really affected me also was that at the end of that conversation, he wrote me a $25 check because he said, I don't agree with anything that your organization is doing, but but I've taken your time, so I feel I owe you. And I love that you are out there doing something in the world. So not only did he really stimulate my thinking about the issue at the time, and really taught me some things, which I have since forgotten, but I was very affected by, again, this willingness to first of all engage me in such a loving and polite and civil way. and that he would even give money to an organization he didn't believe in, just to be nice. Okay, so there was another family that really affected me during that job. They invited me into their home. I knocked on their door and they said, "Oh, come on in. We're just finishing dinner. And what are you doing?" And so I told them what we were up to. And there was a mom and a dad and a son and a daughter. And the son and the daughter were pretty young, like 12 and 14. And what affected me so much was that the son was totally pro-nukes, I think it was. And the mom was totally anti-nukes. And they were just such a fun, delightful family, and so well informed. Like the son had just written some big paper, very impressive for his age, about nuclear energy. And the mom was like, no, I'm so against it for this and this reason. And their ability to have that conversation in such a fun and friendly way also affected me. Again, emotions are more important than the cognitive faculties. The experience of being with people who can disagree and know the facts and argue the interpretation of the facts and still care for one another is huge. And so that really affected me. Again, reinforcing a lot of what I already knew, but then expanding my understanding of how people can debate and look for truth and live in civil society with one another. So all of that was before I even got to college. All of that was before I had even gotten to college. Oh, and when I was working at this political organization, I did experience in that political organization an expectation that one was supposed to think certain things about certain policies of the government, about certain ways of governance, and I didn't like it. I didn't like that. And when people got out of line, there were other people would sort of say, how could you think that way? And there was pressure. There was definitely pressure to think a certain way about every topic, and we were all supposed to sort of agree. And it was just like any group of people. There tends, if you have a bunch of friends, and you're all sort of supposed to think the same way about who knows what. But it was there, and that affected me too, because I didn't like feeling that certain kinds of opinions, expressing them would mean paying some social consequences within the group. Not that anybody would do anything to you, but we all like to be part of the gang. So I definitely experienced that. So then, after a couple of years working for that political organization, I went to college. I went to the University of Chicago, which is a very rigorous university. And I went there because it was had a reputation for academic rigor, and that's what I wanted. There was one professor who made a big difference in my ability to think critically. He was a history professor, and we were just doing a survey of Western civilization. And so we were learning about Martin Luther in the 16th century. And having grown up as a Protestant, I had my prejudice, which I was totally unaware of, that the Protestant view of the Bible was the correct view. And so I remember when we were learning about Martin Luther and his challenging of the Catholic Church and their teachings, I remember saying in class, we were reading a Catholic response, one of the Catholic Church's responses at the time to Luther. And from my Protestant viewpoint, so remember, there's nothing wrong with the fact that I had a Protestant viewpoint. What stopped me from thinking critically was that I was unaware that how much I was reading as a Protestant. If I were reading the same document today, I would be more aware. At the time, I wasn't aware of my own bias. And so I remember saying in class, well, and I said as a throwaway line, I wanted to make a point about the Catholic document. And just as a throwaway line, I said, well, Luther was so obviously correct. So when the church says blah, 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 whatever point I was trying to make. And I just remember the professor just cutting me down. And he was a lovely man. And he just totally said, well, Luther was not obviously correct. And, he went on to say something else. And I remember it's so obvious now, that of course Luther wasn't obviously correct. There was a debate. But it was like somebody telling me that, of course the sun does not rise in the east. I was like, what do you mean that Luther wasn't obviously correct? So, I just was stunned. I remember for the rest of that class thinking, what? And I don't remember how long it took for it to kind of sink in for me to be able to say, oh, gosh, is that a prejudice I have? But it woke me up. And partly because he didn't say it to be nasty. He wasn't trying to cut me down. He was just speaking as a scholar who knew that there were two sides to this debate, and neither side was obviously correct. So he wasn't trying, if he'd been trying to cut me down and being unkind, I would have probably been less likely to examine whether what he said was, whether I had a prejudice. I would have probably been more likely to get into a defensive mode. So that was a key moment in my upbringing for my critical thinking skills. And he taught me a lot. I learned a lot in that one class. So if I hadn't taken that one class, my college education would have done not nearly what it could otherwise have done to teach me critical thinking skills. He really taught us. I ended up majoring in history because of this man, because he really taught us how to read a historical primary text and how to understand it in its context. So that was key. And so I had a lot of critical thinking skills at that point. And, was really, I think, a very good thinker. And when I wrote my thesis for college, it was my professor, not that professor, another history professor was, just loved the thesis that I wrote, which was about 15th century England and the decline of feudalism and the growth of mercantilism, in case you're interested in reading it. It was a lot of fun to write, actually. And yet I didn't know how much I had to learn. And again, what I had to learn was to become more aware of prejudices. This is really what critical thinking is all about, is becoming more and more aware of your biases, your prejudices. And we all have them. It's fine to have a bias. It's fine that I'm a Protestant. It's fine that I'm a white person. It's fine that I came from a poor family that made its way up to the middle class. There's no bad way to be. But what we want to do is become more and more aware of how does the fact that I'm white color who I listen to, what I think is true. How does the fact that I'm a Protestant color who I think is correct, who I listen to? How does the fact that I am educated and now am in the middle class and live in New York City? How do these things affect how I see things? That's all. That's all critical thinking really is becoming more and more aware of the specific place in which you are. And I learned that much more in my graduate education. I went to Union Theological Seminary, got a master's in divinity in the early 90s. And what the biggest learning that happened for me there, for the first time, I was really at a place where I was forced, I would say, to confront what it means to be white in America. And that happened because Union Seminary is, there's a lot of consciousness about the importance of our ethnicities on how we think. I had a lot of Black professors, and I don't think I ever had a non-white professor in college. I certainly didn't have anything but white teachers in high school. And some were more engaged more with racial issues than others, but the student body, the seminary tended to attract African Americans who were very conscious of race identity and identity politics, we call it nowadays, and how that affects how we read the Bible, how it affects our religious identities, and boy, was it a blessing to me. It was uncomfortable, really uncomfortable, which has to happen, you know. I mean, I think we have to be uncomfortable in order to make progress in terms of our ability to think critically. I don't think it happens without some discomfort. So, I mean, it was really uncomfortable. I thought I was a really non-prejudiced person, and I think mostly I was. I had a friend, I was lucky enough to have a friend in seminary who was Black, and he challenged me. You know, he said, well, you know, if your parents were so open, you know, where did they raise you? You know, they raised you in an all-white town. And this is not to blame my parents, but he just challenged me, you know, and I did have just, you know, one absorbs in our society certain thoughts and feelings about racial issues. So I was forced to talk about them, you know, and I think with a lot of white people, we're really afraid of being accused, you know. And sometimes it happens, you know, it totally happens, you know. Sometimes we are accused of being racist, and we're like, what? I'm not racist, you know. And sometimes those accusations may be right, and sometimes they may be wrong. You can be accused of racism and unfairly, right? That happens in life. But what I had 3 years in the master's program of constantly kind of having to engage in these issues. And I came out the other side so grateful because really my eyes were really opened. They were really opened about the ways in which, well, just what it's like, about what it's like to be a white person in a society that is privileges white people, you know. And part of what happens is when you're in the privileged group is you are simply unaware of what is happening with the unprivileged group. That's the point of privilege. You don't have to think about it. And you tend to have these feelings about, well, you know, I was able to get myself to college, you know, and my parents were poor, so what's wrong with that person, you know? And who's going to challenge you on it because you live in your white world? And it is difficult to talk about race in our society. It's really difficult. And, I'd love to do some videos about that. But that really, releasing my heart and mind from the prison of unknowing my own privilege was really important to my ability to think critically. And look, none of us are perfect, so I hope I will continue. It's always fun for me because I think it can be scary to have your prejudices challenged. I don't think that will ever change. Because we like to know what we know. We like to know what we know. And when we find out that what we know maybe isn't so sure, it's frightening. It's frightening. It's frightening. But I'm grateful by how often I have had the experience of being grateful to have those prejudices exposed to me. And so all of that background, and I live in a very busy street, so you're hearing sirens and things. I am really, this is why I feel that I have some pretty good critical thinking skills, because I'm aware of the prejudices that I have had, and I think I'm fairly aware of who I am and where I am. And that was something that James Cone, the father of Black theology, he really emphasized that in his classes with us. Like he was like, be who you are. If you're white, like embrace it. If you're Black, embrace it. If you're mixed, embrace it. Just be who you are. Just be aware that that's who you are. And there's beauty in that. It's all wonderful. It's all a gift. If you come from rich, then just know that's great. If you come from poor, then you have a wisdom, that every place that a person can be gives them a kind of wisdom. A rich person has a wisdom that a poor person doesn't have. There's that book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, where he talks about his rich dad had some real wisdom that his poor dad didn't have, right? But the poor person has wisdom, and this is something I really learned in my Christian upbringing. Blessed are the poor. I really believe that it is a blessing to be poor, to be persecuted, to be hungry. I believe that those things are blessings because they give you a certain perspective that the power people don't have. But the power people really, to be capable of thinking clearly, the power people something has to get them to understand that as a white person, something has to happen to get the white person to understand that a Black person really has something to teach you. And the rich person has to really come to understand that the poor person has something to teach you. I think that people who are in the less privileged positions, they kind of have a tendency to see both sides, because if it's the rich, and in our society, the white person, and in our society, the straight person, they tend to have the airwaves, right? So their wisdom gets communicated. So the people who are not in those status positions tend to understand, oh yeah, there's a lot of wisdom that these people have to share. But it doesn't tend to go the other way. That's what I have experienced to be true. So I wanted to give you that background on me. I now, oh golly, I didn't even tell you. I work at an organization that I won't mention the name of it, only because I don't want to in any way imply that the organization I work for is endorsing what I'm doing. This I am doing completely what little free time I have. And but the organization I work for teaches a mind-body connection practice. So the ability to articulate what one is feeling, how one is experiencing life is really important. So things like any kind of mind-body connection practice, whatever your religious tradition is, prayer or meditation, I think is really, really helpful to critical thinking skills, and or any kind of, yoga. I do a lot of yoga also. Anything that connects you with what's happening in your body and how you're feeling, your emotional and spiritual life, is actually the most important part of critical thinking. There are also just skills, thinking skills, cognitive skills that one needs, but I can't overemphasize enough that the emotional, the connection between noticing with your mind what your body is experiencing, what you're experiencing emotionally, is what you need most. And so that's why at the beginning I said it doesn't really have a lot to do with formal university education. As I say, I think that can help, but the bigger thing is the emotional, your ability to articulate your own emotional reactions and your own prejudices, and be aware of them. You don't have to get rid of them, but you do have to be aware of them if you want to really to be able to distinguish truth from falsehood. So that's a little about me, and I hope that helps you understand where I'm coming from. And if you made it all the way to the end, thanks. I hope it was reasonably succinct. It wasn't really, was it? Anyway, thanks for watching.